Appreciate all of you who are joining us today. Got a lot of topics to cover here, and I'm going to be going through this fairly rapidly. And already having trouble getting my screen to advance. There it goes. Okay, you know the topic from what was advertised here. I am going to spend most of the first probably 15-20 minutes showing you a lot of different blockchain applications in business. There's new ones coming out every day, and it's far more than just something that affects the financial services industry. Just from the supply chain applications alone, every industry is going to be impacted. And there's all kinds of blockchain application areas you need to be aware of. What we're going to spend the second half of the briefing on is looking at a tool that our consulting company uses to assess what are blockchain applications that are worth pursuing. A lot of them are still in the developmental stage. A lot of them are very difficult to implement. Either they don't have the transaction speeds, or you got to get too many partners on board to make it work. A lot of criteria you need to consider, and that's what the tool we use and are going to be showing you today addresses, is helping you assess, is this blockchain application relevant to my firm and worth pursuing? Is it just not ready yet or just too risky to go after? My qualifications, you saw them earlier, they're outlined here. I've done IT work throughout my career. I actually go back to punch cards, if any of you remember those. And the first programming language I used, called Algol, is long obsolete. But I've been doing project management, and as I'm going to explain in this presentation, most blockchain application work is not just IT skills, it's business process redesign. So a broad business background and the experience that a lot of you have is very, very relevant. So let's keep moving on. I'm not going to spend more than a couple minutes explaining blockchain. I think most of you are familiar with it. I will give you a quick overview, and I'm going to give you a lot of cautions, because what I find in working with our clients is most people think of blockchain, they think of Bitcoin. And for most of the business applications, you're not going to be using the Bitcoin blockchain. And a lot of the things that occur in the Bitcoin blockchain are irrelevant and disadvantageous even for business applications. So you need to be able to explain blockchain to folks and understand it, but not just the proof of work methodology that Bitcoin works. So again, when we're talking about blockchain, we're talking about a distributed ledger or distributed database, but it is much, much more than that. And we'll explain that a lot in the applications here. The big difference, though, is that instead of having a middleman, one central database, in a blockchain, everyone has it on their system. Now, already I'm getting into trouble because there are blockchains, Hyperledger we're going to be talking about, where that isn't exactly true. There still can be a middleman. There still can be some information that isn't available to every node on the peer-to-peer network. But in general, a blockchain is replacing a central database with data that's shared on all the computers, and then you have to have a mechanism to achieve consensus. And 95% of people, when you talk about this, they're going to assume you're doing proof of work, which is what Bitcoin uses. And most of the time in business applications, my bet is you're not going to be using proof of work. But in a proof of work, which people understand the most and think of the most in blockchain, basically if computer nodes that are competing with each other to not just assemble the block of transactions, the group of transactions that are about to be added to the database, you're also trying to solve a hashing code problem, because every block of data in a blockchain, as you know, is locked in. I've got our business logo up on the slide because our business logo is kind of designed to help us explain blockchain. Every past bit of data that gets recorded in a blockchain is there, and you can't change it. If you change any piece of information on your node and try to send this out to the other computers on the node saying, hey, I've got the right database, the hash codes won't work. You make one little change and the hash code doesn't work, and all the other computer nodes are going to recognize that, hey, this is a false database, something has been changed, and they'll reject it. So in a normal proof of work concept blockchain like Bitcoin and Ethereum uses it some on some of their versions, some they don't. That's what you've got is computers competing, or mining is the term you use for proof of work, to lock in the next block of transactions. The other word you hear and need to understand is immutable. And in blockchain, once the data is entered into that group of transactions and it's approved by consensus of the majority of the computers are on the node, and they say, yes, we accept this, Once it's locked into that blockchain, you can't change it. So you'll hear the term immutable, meaning it's immutable data. You cannot change it. You can add to an account, you can subtract from an account, you can add documents to an account, but you can't go back and change a past transaction. So I've talked about proof of work, and again, that's what people are going to assume you're talking about, but in most business applications, you're going to find you're probably not going to use proof of work. So again, I won't get into the details, but there's proof of stake, and the most important thing I want to talk about is private versus public blockchains. Bitcoin is the first blockchain, obviously, is a public blockchain. Ethereum is a public blockchain. But Hyperledger and probably most of the blockchains that you're going to be using in business are going to be private blockchains. The difference is you can't get your computer onto a private blockchain unless you're approved. You have to be a partner, your computer has to be registered, and you can't get into it. And there's big advantages to that. I mean, North Korean hackers sponsored by the North Korean government, they are on the Bitcoin blockchain. They can do mining. They can accept ransomware in Bitcoin. And so if you have a private blockchain, which most of us in business are going to be more interested in, you can keep folks like that out of your blockchain, which adds to the security of it and not worrying about people looking at information when you don't want them looking at it. The other disadvantage you may run into, so you may have a CEO or a CTO who thinks they know a lot about blockchain, and you got a proposal and they say, well, we can't do it because the energy cost is too high. Again, that only applies to Bitcoin and proof of work and their specific application. That's an irrelevant concern for most private blockchains. So one last slide here on private blockchains before we move on. Hyperledger is a term I'm going to use a lot, and if you're not familiar with Hyperledger, you really need to become familiar with Hyperledger, and we'll address it throughout this briefing. It's a collection of blockchains, but they're all private blockchains, and there's different types. Hyperledger Fabric is the one you see described here. And Hyperledger is supported by IBM and Deloitte and a lot of the biggest companies. And it's open to any company. You don't have to be a big company to use it, but they're developing private blockchains which are really fantastic for business use. So again, we're very thankful to Bitcoin for what they did in developing blockchain, but for most of us in the business world, Bitcoin is really irrelevant. And it's actually sometimes harmful because people always assume when you say blockchain, you need to assume and be careful that the people, when they're hearing you, they're probably thinking about Bitcoin. So you've got to sometimes counter those objections they've got. And here's my last caution, because I've run into this a lot. I'm going to recommend you go to meetup groups later on to learn more about blockchain. And as you deal with people who are programmers and working in blockchain, what you're going to find out is that the blockchain enthusiasts think that proof of work is the only way to do it. And blockchain enthusiasts actually say that Hyperledger isn't a blockchain. A Hyperledger can have some middleman control, which is just anathema and a horrible thing to the Bitcoin enthusiasts. And a lot of libertarians and folks who originally got into Bitcoin and blockchain, they hate central control, they hate big banks, so they love Bitcoin. And when you talk about business blockchains like Hyperledger, a lot of folks don't like that. So just my advice, if you're talking to someone and they ask you, do you believe in proof of work? That's a red flag. You're talking to a Bitcoin enthusiast, and if you say anything other than Bitcoin rules, you're going to be in trouble. But the more serious problem is when you're dealing with your superiors and others in your organization, you have to be careful, because normally when you talk about blockchain, you're going to be thinking about Ethereum or Hyperledger. They're going to be thinking Bitcoin, so you got to watch out for that, or a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding can occur. So you're familiar with most of the advantages of blockchain. These kind of general ones are described here. What we're going to do now in the next 15 minutes is go through a lot of specific, new, exciting applications of blockchain for business use. So Ethereum is probably today the best, most important public blockchain out there, much, much more important than Bitcoin. And it was designed in 2014. It actually didn't launch until 2015, so it's a very, very new technology. But it was designed to have smart contracts, to have programming designed into it, so it does a lot more than just share information in a very secure manner like all blockchain does. And that's the big advantage of Ethereum. It's not just a blockchain. Ethereum is really a computing network that can execute programs that are programmed into the Ethereum blockchain. So every Ethereum node runs the Ethereum virtual machine, as it's called, and they do that to maintain consensus across the blockchain, but they also do it so you can execute and use the smart contracts that are programmed into the Ethereum blockchain. So you can easily take an existing smart contract that's already there on the blockchain, you can modify it if you need to, or you can use it as it is. You call up the address, you execute the contract. And these contracts are written in languages like Solidity, for example, is one of the programming languages on Ethereum, but it's based on JavaScript. So it's very, very easy to learn these languages in Ethereum and let you do all kinds of business applications. And I'm going to be talking about smart contracts on the next slide and throughout this briefing because they are fantastic for business use. Ethereum was designed to be a blockchain that's ideal for business use, and it really is. There's some terminology you get into if you start using Ethereum. The cryptocurrency you use to run transactions on the Ethereum blockchain is called Ether, but when you do an actual transaction, they break down Ether into a small part called gas. So there's some terminology and some learning curves to go through to get into blockchain and business use, but it's really not that hard. And in the last few slides, I'm going to actually show you some ways that you can learn more about it. Obviously, Starweaver gives you a lot of options, and I'll talk about meetup groups and some other ways as well. Let's turn now to smart contracts, go into those into a little more detail. They run on the Ethereum blockchain, but they've been copied. Hyperledger, I'll tell you right now, Hyperledger started by copying the Ethereum blockchain. Fork is the technical term. But smart contracts are in wide use on Hyperledger as well as Ethereum, and then all kinds of other private blockchains that companies are using smart contracts. And basically, a smart contract has the rules for a contract or agreement that's written in such a way that the information that you need to verify that contract conditions have been met can be entered or read into the smart contract, and the Internet of Things is often used for this. And then once the terms of the contract are met, it's a program. And the blockchain will execute that contract automatically when the conditions are met. So it's kind of like having a legal agreement, but you don't need a court and you don't need lawyers. Once the contract is agreed upon, the example they have here is an option contract that's written as a smart contract, the financial option. So it collects the financial data from approved authoritative databases, and then once the terms are met, the contract decides that, hey, your option expired worthless, this contract is dead, nothing gets paid, or it says that, hey, you made it, the conditions were met, you get this payoff based on the stock price or whatever the underlying asset is. So you can start to see now how powerful blockchain is when you start adding on smart contracts and some other features we're going to talk about. So for example, let's say we had a supply chain blockchain and it has a contract, a smart contract in it that says, if your container that is being tracked on the blockchain reaches the port of Los Angeles by April 15, you meet the terms of the contract and it's going to execute at a set price. But if it's 10 days late, you have a 10% penalty. So all kinds of things can be on here. We'll talk about Internet of Things a little bit later, but just real quickly, you could have a temperature gauge that's part of the input to the blockchain. So back to our supply chain example, the contract will say that, hey, if your temperature ever falls outside of the range, you get a penalty. And maybe the contract gets canceled altogether if it's fresh foods, refrigerated foods that fall out. So smart contracts are very useful in applications, and they're being used in the insurance industry today, in trade finance and letters of credit. IBM, AIG, all kinds of big companies and big banks are using smart contracts and blockchains today, and it's just going to keep spreading in use. I've talked about Hyperledger here. Some other blockchains are listed up there. Just kind of, if you want to request the slides, the Starweaver can get them to you. You can email me to get them as well. I just mentioned some of these just because if you go to some blockchain meetup groups and other forums, you're going to have people talking about Zcash and Monero. So you need to do a little bit of learning about them. But again, the key ones, the key blockchains for business use are Ethereum and Hyperledger. And Hyperledger, described there on the bottom, has private blockchains. They're designed for faster transactions. They absolutely are using smart contracts, and they're being used in a lot of applications we'll be showing you here in the next few slides. I'm now going to go through some different examples of blockchain applications, and we're going to get to my tool to assess blockchain applications. In 2016 and through 2017, most of the blockchain applications were in the three industry areas you see down there. Of course, financial services were first because Bitcoin started off the blockchain frenzy. But there's so many applications to share data that supply chain has been a big application. And the reason healthcare has been a really popular area for blockchain applications is the security of a blockchain. If you've got medical information that you want to share, you cannot let that be hacked. You can't let that be compromised. You're violating HIPAA regulations, you're inviting huge lawsuits, all kinds of problems. So for decades, I'm sure you've heard about people saying, oh, we're going to have this great new automated healthcare database system. I've heard that for decades, even worked with clients on it decades ago, and they overwhelmingly failed. And the reason they failed is data passing through the internet is not secure. Well, blockchain solves that problem. It is almost impossible to hack blockchain data, so now healthcare is jumping onto this in a big way. They've always wanted to be able to share healthcare information, and because of the security of blockchain, now they can do that. Here's a supply chain example of using blockchain. Every industry has applications where you need to share data and have strong security against hacking. And in the supply chain, what you've got is there's so many parties involved. They all have their separate little databases, and generally they don't trust each other. I gave you the example earlier of the temperature. You know, if you've got fresh fish being transported, you want to be sure, how old is this fish? Well, with the blockchain, you can do that, because if you look at that step 2 there, sensors continuously transmit data about time and location to the blockchain. If my fish crate is moving through the blockchain, I can see it and I can trust that the data is true. And the Internet of Things can help me out here too, because the example I gave you of arriving in a port, you got RFID sensors on the package, and the blockchain can pick that up if it's programmed to do that and record that this fish now has arrived at this port at this time. And then it doesn't show you in this slide, but I gave you the example earlier, having temperature sensors. You've seen that already in a lot of blockchain applications in the supply chain. Every day, I mean, as I was preparing this briefing, finalizing it, this slide here is from February 27, just a couple days ago. There's Porsche announcing a big new blockchain application. They're exploring lots of blockchain applications at Porsche because there are so many, and it's already beyond clear that blockchain technology has massive application areas in business. It is not just for cryptocurrency and financial information. It's not just for the supply chain. And note what their financial strategist here, the Porsche financial strategist, cited. It's a great way to transfer and share data securely, and great for payment systems where you can use cryptocurrencies. It's a full-time job just to keep track of the new blockchain announcements and ICOs, initial coin offerings that are launched. And in recent months, there's been at least a dozen ICOs launching every day, and there's probably more than that, but a lot of them are all launching overseas and aren't tracked as well. It is true that most initial coin offerings are going to fail, but it's not true that most are Ponzi schemes. The odds of any new company that launches surviving to 5 years is low, even in simple businesses. But there are all kinds of blockchain applications launching, big firms doing it, and then startup firms doing it through initial coin offerings. Many of the new blockchain businesses are fairly simple. This is just a money transfer business. Initially, they're just dealing in dollars and Mexican pesos, but this is an easy platform to scale to other countries and locations. For example, in Germany, we just mentioned Porsche. In Germany, they have huge foreign workers, guest workers from Turkey, and they're constantly sending Deutschmarks and money from Germany back to their poorer families in Turkey, so that's an application here as well. Now, Bridge 21's target for disruption and displacement is, of course, Western Union, and my bet is that Western Union is either going to have its profitability cut way back, or they may be driven out of business, or they're going to have to just adopt this blockchain technology themselves, because the wire transfer fees are very, very high, and blockchain is ideal for replacing bank wires. In fintech, the 2 most promising short-term use cases remain payments and trade finance. Larger banks, including correspondent banks, are increasingly interested in blockchain payment systems. all of the big banks have been studying blockchain and starting to use it for years now, and it's just going to be rampantly used in the financial industry. But there's so many related industries like money transfer and wires where it's also being used. Trade finance is expected to go live on blockchain in 2018, and the insurance sector is also moving into blockchain for claims processing and largely a lot of the smart contract features. So overall, what you see is that blockchain, it's probably its most important value and one that applies to almost every business, is having a trusted source of data that you can share and you can rely upon, even if you're sharing it with business partners that you don't necessarily trust. So manufacturing industry, they're going to be using blockchain in these industries. And probably the biggest growth area of blockchain in this segment is going to be supply chain management initially. And we've talked a little bit about that, and we'll have some more slides on it. But it can be much more than that. It can just be consortiums trying to share information, get rid of counterfeit good problems, those kinds of things. The other advantage of the blockchain is with the smart contracts added to it, you can automate a lot of the billing and processing. So for example, when you have verification from the smart chain, from the blockchain that your shipment arrived at a warehouse, well, you can now automatically execute the payment. You don't have to have a person trying to find out has it arrived, then manually going into an IT system to execute a payment contract. They can all be executed automatically. And in the example I gave you earlier, if they're late and part of your contract says it's a 10% penalty if you're X days late, smart contract executes that automatically. So there's big advantages to that. At the bottom of the slide there's a Hyperledger study quoted talking about an example of how Airbus and GE, if they know that there's a part shortage, the earlier they find out and can react to it, the better. I mean, they can save thousands of dollars and more if you know there's a delay. Right now in a supply chain or typical industry situation, you can't find that out because you don't have the information. With a blockchain, you can share information amongst parties who don't necessarily trust each other, but do trust the blockchain to get information around. Counterfeit goods is a really big application of blockchain. It's a lot of people, I used to think that counterfeit goods was for, the really big brand name, huge brands, but even small companies. There's an example listed here of a 5-employee company in California that had a nice product up on eBay, and they soon found out that there was a Chinese firm that was copying them and sending out a counterfeit version of their good. In the electronics industry, we've done some consulting in that area. It's a really big problem. Most of our computer chips are manufactured overseas, a lot of the specialty chips as well, and a lot of electronic parts, and they're expensive and they're pretty easy for knockoff firms to copy and get you into a lot of trouble with counterfeit goods. So you see trillions of dollars of waste in counterfeit goods. Blockchain can largely solve that because if you've got the details locked into the blockchain and the contracts there, you can verify, and I'll show you some examples of that on some later slides. Another big use area for blockchain that's developing is digital assets. So imagine for a minute if the title for your car or your house was not a piece of paper, but was recorded as a digital asset in one official site on a blockchain, so it can't be stolen from you or hacked or altered. So if you want to see if there's liens on your house, you can use that. This is a slide describing Propi, and there's about 20 at least ICOs that have launched to try to do this. It's going to be hard to do, and we're going to get into implementation issues and how you evaluate those later on. This is going to be a difficult thing to do because you've got to get the government to buy off on it, a lot of different parties to agree to use your blockchain. I have my doubts that you're going to be able to do this in California. On the other hand, there are countries that have said they are going to do this on a national level, and as they do it and the advantages are felt, you may see expanding, but that's a big issue to concern yourself with is, can you get the parties you need to participate in your blockchain agree to do it? And this is going to be a hard one. My firm, Blockchain Business Consultants, we maintain a database of applications we see in blockchain. So we use these with our clients who are trying to figure out what kind of blockchain applications might be worth exploring, and if there's a close fit to something you're interested in, where to do further research. You can see how cryptocurrency and financial applications have been pretty popular. but increasingly they're coming out in all types of industries. Here's a really neat blockchain application that's not a theory, it actually works. IBM and Maersk Shipping have been working on this global ocean shipping blockchain, and it works. And it's really advantageous to use because they have customs officials, customs government offices that use this system, at least where they've tested it on some African and European countries. And so that's great because you got to make sure that something you're buying is official. Again, the counterfeit problem, you got to make sure it's got the proper paperwork, it's a legal good shipment and not a blood diamond or something that's illegally being traded. So they will lock in the actual customs forms on this. Now they're running this on Hyperledger. Again, as I've told you, Hyperledger and Ethereum are going to be the main blockchains you use. There's a few others we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is a great example of a blockchain business application. IBM and Maersk are opening this up to other companies to start using. There are a lot of other supply chain applications. We'll talk about a few more here in the next slides. And in January of this year, you may have heard that Kodak, which is kind of a struggling old technology company, launched its own Kodak coin, a cryptocurrency for photographers, and as soon as that was announced, their stock shot up 60%. And they're using these Kodak coins as tokens inside their new blockchain that is going to give you digital rights if you own photography. If you own a picture, you can register it in their system and use it that way. Another company that we're helping with, and this is normally we don't name our clients, but in this case our client is SharedChain and we're authorized to use them because they're trying to raise capital right now. They're adding blockchain to their supply chain, their existing supply chain software business. And you're going to see more and more companies doing this, adding blockchain because there's an investment return because blockchain is so popular. I won't go through this in detail, but this is a diagram of the SharedChain system that they're using to use the internet to track all aspects of distribution in a supply chain. And the other reason they're adding blockchain, besides the fact that they need it for legitimate supply chain purposes, is they're going to have a token, a cryptocurrency token that SharedChain controls to use their supply chain system. And what they're hoping is this token's price is going to go up in value. So this graph here shows you the price of the Ether, the cryptocurrency used on the Ethereum blockchain. So it was issued at pennies in values. Latest price is around $840. So phenomenal growth, and this is what a lot of companies are hoping is going to happen, is that their cryptocurrency that you need to pay for transactions using their blockchain is going to grow in value. And for a lot of companies, SharedChain may be one of them. It's not the equity in SharedChain that may have the big value, but the value of the cryptocurrency tokens that the company is going to control and own, and investors will be allowed to buy as well. So overall, initial coin offerings, the returns they've had have been pretty phenomenal. A VC firm just did a study and found that the return on investment in cryptocurrency in ICOs was 1,320%. Now, by the way, Bitcoin never had an ICO, so Bitcoin isn't included in this data. So a lot of people are attracted to ICOs. Here's another example. Stratus it's kind of a blockchain as a service platform, and there's other people out there doing this, but Stratus is one of the better ones. Again, they issued their token at a cent, and currently it fluctuates around $10. So if you invest in this, if you invest in the right ICO that has a token that's going to have real value, it could do really well for you. You have to be really careful in ICOs. If you're investing them in there, you're considering doing it for your firm, you have to avoid equity features or you're going to get in trouble with the SEC and other regulatory authorities. This is a company that did an ICO for a World Aquarium, and it could have been an ideal utility token. A utility token means the token has value in its use. It's not a piece of equity. But these folks decided they're going to share profit, or dividends. As soon as you do that, now you're in equity and you run into trouble with that. This is a company that did it the right way, Kick. They issued a pure utility token. You don't own any ownership in the firm. You don't get any profits or dividends. and they raised a lot of money on their ICO for their token. Just quickly, this is Fortitude Ranch. This is an ICO that my company managed. It's a survival company. Again, any business can issue an ICO and use a cryptocurrency either for a blockchain application, or in this case, the token is used to buy membership in this recreational and survival facility. And what you see with most ICOs, this is a very typical one, they're using what's called an ERC20 token. It runs on the Ethereum blockchain. It's a standardized token, meaning that any ERC compatible wallet, digital wallet, can take a Fortitude token. You can trade them on those currencies. And this is fairly typical for what you'll see. And what you're going to see, I believe, going forward is more and more companies like Fortitude Ranch issuing a cryptocurrency token, not to run a blockchain, but to help fund a new product or service. So for example, Terrafuga is not doing an ICO, but I list them as an example because they're trying to do this flying car, which is very expensive, and they're going to do new versions of it. Well, when this flying car comes out, it's going to be very popular, and if you give token holders the right to have priority to buy, that makes your token far more valuable. That's what Fortitude Ranch did. It's a survival community. Right now, hardly anyone does prepping, but when there's a crisis, all of a sudden, everyone's going to want to have a place in Fortitude Ranch. If you want to get into the survival community, at that point, you're going to have to be able to buy your membership with their Fortitude tokens. So the price of their Fortitude tokens, they expect, will surge in value. So you could be issuing a new electric bike, some other new product, and rather than having to fund it all yourself, a company could issue an ICO, issue a token to let you buy that product with priority to buy when waitlists form, and now you have your future customers helping you fund the development of a new product. Another really big potential application area of blockchain. So how do you evaluate all these potential applications? How are you to decide which ones are right for your firm to use? Which ones really aren't ready yet, the technology isn't there? Which ones are too difficult because it's hard to get your partners to agree to do it? What we do is we use multi-criteria decision analysis to help us decide and help our clients determine what are the best blockchain applications worth pursuing. And it could be, and we've had this with a couple clients where right now there just aren't any worth pursuing. So it looks very difficult and complex, but actually the analysis is quite simple. And if you use the software and get a few hours of training on it, which we offer with Starweaver, you can do that. So basically you've got blockchain applications in rows, and they're rated and compared by all the criteria that are in columns along the top. So we'll go through several slides now talking about different criteria and how you rate them, how you do the scales, and how you use this. But you have different weights. Some factors are more important than others. That little red number you see along the top, the 4 and the 1 and the 2, those are weights because some factors are more important. So we're going to now go through and talk about how you go use this tool to help you assess, or your clients assess, what is a worthwhile blockchain application to pursue. Okay, and this is an example we did for a client where they're looking at 7 potential blockchain applications, and we assess them by 20 different performance criteria. Everyone thinks, well, it's just the bottom line. Well, you will calculate your probability. You will try to calculate what's the profit I'm going to get from this application, what are the costs, but there are a lot more other issues to consider. For example, can you get your partners to agree to use your blockchain if you get it set up and running? Are there regulatory risks? What is the transaction and processing speed you need? Can the blockchain provide it? So you have to go through all those issues. In trying to decide the criteria, generally what we do is we meet with clients, and it's just largely a brainstorming session. It depends absolutely on the industry you're in, it depends on your business, it depends on the kind of application you're doing, what criteria matter. On the right here you see this little chart here, and this is actually from the software. What you do is you type in the different criteria here, and they're organized in what's called a hierarchy. So if you look on the left column, the top level measures, we wanted to consider, first of all, what are the impact on competitive advantages for our firm? is it low cost production? Is it customer loyalty? They vary by firm. Second general area was business processes, and this will occur in any kind of blockchain application. Is it largely information and database stuff? Is it largely financial business processes? Is it product delivery processes? Because we're going to compare how the different blockchain application options compare across this criteria. The next high level criteria is the blockchain technology and IT capacity, the software capability, processing speed, transaction volume. So we're breaking them down in the mid-level measures. And then we get in, of course, costs and the return on investment we expect to have, but you also need to consider probability of success. A blockchain application is not automatic. You may have trouble developing it. You may develop it successfully, but your partners, the people you need to use it with you, refuse to use it. So you have to consider that, and then there's other risks considered there. So you list the criteria, you weigh them, and you put them into this scorecard. And by the way, the software which we give you when we give you training automates all this. You don't type in a scorecard like this. You just type in the information and it's generated. So let me quickly go through a couple examples here. The 3 and the 1 that are circulated, those are the weights. So in terms of impact and competitive advantages, this firm determined that they're most concerned with having low cost production, and that is 3 times more important for them than reliable delivery, so they put more weight on it. And now I told you there were 7 options. I've only shown 3 of them here. But in this case, let's look at the first one, the overseas manufacturing and shipping data blockchain. The degree of control and leverage criteria, I circled there the 8. We were confident we could control that and we would get good value from having this blockchain use in this business process. For the health records business, there was a problem. It rated low, and I'll go over the scales in a minute. And the problem was we didn't control the information. We weren't sure we could get it. So let's look at this now, the scales. You make your own scales on this, but you have to be consistent. I like using a 10-point scale. If you want to use a 5-point scale, anything you want, the software will accommodate that. But you just have to be consistent, meaning 10 is always fantastic. It's a huge profit opportunity. It's absolutely great performance. 5 is a neutral score, and 0 is a catastrophic, really bad score. That's a general score. On the right, you can develop very specific scales for some measures. So for example, in the low-cost producer, we actually calculated the ultimate price impact we expected from the different blockchain applications, and then we developed this scale. If you got an 8% reduction in delivered product cost, you scored that a 10. If there was no change, again, neutral, we always use as 5. And if it was up to 4% higher cost because the blockchain had expenses and was not helping us reduce our costs, that rated as a 0. So that's the general process you go through. And I want to, at this point, inject this point and plug this book by Magyar, the blockchain business, the business blockchain. And his point, and he is absolutely right, is that blockchain work is not largely IT driven. IT is not most of the people you're going to need in doing it. IT is not most of the problems usually. It's other aspects of the business process you're trying to redesign and now execute it with blockchain. That's 80% of the work, was his view. And that's one of the reasons why I got into blockchain, is that I've done a lot of business process work, have a lot of general business knowledge. So yes, I've got IT background, but the business process work is actually more important for you in blockchain work. So another big issue for blockchains nowadays is processing speed and transaction volumes, and their problems here, as you probably know. Bitcoin, again, that's the problem you're going to run into. Your boss is going to say, oh, the processing speeds are too slow. Well, for Bitcoin, that's true. It takes 10 minutes to run a block of transactions. But there are other blockchains out there that will process them in seconds. The volume is still a problem, and you can see it here in some of the ratings with the slower scores, is that credit cards at this point don't have to worry about blockchain because they can do 50,000 transactions a second. Blockchains are getting faster, but they're still nowhere near that amount. So you have to consider all those issues, and there are improvements coming. Blockchain firms are aware of the limits, and they're working to solve them. So the last thing in our area was we get into the return on investment, and we use your ROIC standards. I mean, every firm tends to calculate their return on equity or return on invested capital differently. You have to consider the probability of success. For example, if you look at that big red 2 there, a really low score on this health records business, The problem is they just don't believe that they're going to get all the partners they need to agree to accept it. There are just a lot of number of competitors, and they just don't see them participating. So that's what hurt the score for this business. You got to consider security risks. If you're doing an ICO, you're obviously getting into a lot of risk. But there are other regulatory issues you have to consider as well, other risks specific to your company or to the applications you're looking at or industry. And one notion I want to put in here is that don't assume that a blockchain is absolutely secure, absolutely hack-proof. That's not true. I published this article on Medium, and I also put it in LinkedIn a couple months ago, saying that I think there's a good chance that the NSA, our government, could try to take down the Bitcoin blockchain at some point, because North Korea is using it to evade sanctions. They use it to do ransomware, they're using it to make money, and there's a good chance, I think, that the NSA or the Russian Hacker Federation could decide some point that, hey, we're going to go after Bitcoin, and they could do it by a computer network attack. Again, you got to control 51% of the nodes in a proof of work model that Bitcoin uses. Well, if you have NSA or other big Russian or Chinese government capability to do computer network attack and take out the big mining nodes, well, at that point, it's not too hard for you to bring up a couple thousand of your computers and take over the Bitcoin blockchain. And just, I'm not going to get into this in detail, but any technology that comes out is misused, and blockchain is no different. I made a prediction last year in a presentation to the American Association of Individual Investors. I said that sooner or later you're going to see blockchain used to ransom people, not just computers, and that actually happened in December. So at the end, what you do is you add up all the scores, you compare them by their weights, and you look at the average, weighted average score. And in this case, the first option scored the highest, an 8.3 on our 10-point scale. That healthcare records business scored the worst, and it was largely because of the problems that you couldn't get your partners to use it. Now, there aren't a lot of low scores here, because if there was an application that was really, really bad, we didn't bother looking at it. So this is what we generally see, is that a lot of the applications will rate high, some will be close. But what you can now do as a company is, if you say, yeah, we're going to pick these three and investigate them further, and we may even actually start implementing one of them. That's the nice use of this tool. Another really nice application of this tool is to get consensus and to resolve disagreements that are going to come up when you're doing these assessments. And I guarantee you, you are going to have disagreements on stuff. And the nice thing about this multi-criteria decision analysis tool is it helps you resolve them, because what you'll find is, let's say you get someone who says, no, this doesn't rate a 4, I think it rates an 8. And rather than trying to argue about is it a 4 or is it an 8, what you do is you change the 4 to an 8, and you see, does the ranking change? And what happens is, when you have 20 different criteria, you can disagree violently, even a 0 to a 10 on one of them, and rather than trying to resolve the agreement, just change it. And if option number 1 still rates the highest, you don't have to have that long debate. You can do sensitivity analysis. What if I'm not really sure if this is an 8 or a 5? It's somewhere in there, I can't really tell. You put in both. This is just a fantastic tool for helping you resolve disagreements and come to consensus. And I've used it not just for blockchain, but for other applications as well. If you're the person presenting the blockchain assessment to your boss, the CEO or CIO, this is also a really valuable tool to have, because it helps impress them that you really did your homework, you did your analysis, you considered all the risks, all the costs, all the problems that might go wrong. You just didn't estimate, I think this one will generate this much money and this blockchain application would generate that. There's too many risks and assumptions that you need to disclose to the boss when you're making the presentation, and this is a great tool for doing this. We are going to be doing, I believe, a 4-hour seminar and training course on helping your firm doing this. So if your firm is interested in learning this tool, Starweaver can set up an online or an in-person training program, and we can provide you the software and train you on how to use it. And we even do work examples on cases and blockchain applications on your specific area of interest in this in our 4-hour sessions. And the software is basically a Visual Basic macro program that runs on Excel. So it's not that difficult to use. We can train you how to use it. The other thing we'll show you in our class is how to present it well, because when you're in with the CAO, I've presented this to CEOs, I don't just throw this whole scorecard up to them at once. That can be a little overwhelming. But we show you how to show it over time in little parts and go through it that way. I'm going to skip to the next 2 slides so we can get to questions, but a lot of people are looking at blockchain and crypto asset investments, ICOs. There are a lot of risks in using them. Again, the nice thing about blockchain is there's no middleman. The bad thing about blockchain is there's no middleman. So if you make a mistake and you send your Bitcoin or your Ether or your other ERC20 token currency to the wrong address, there's no one you can call to say, hey, would you send that back? Unless it's the other party and they agree to do that, and they probably won't. And people lose a lot of money by making dumb mistakes, losing their passwords, and you have to protect your password so they can be hacked. So some advice here on this slide on how to get into it. And if you need outside due diligence in evaluating an ICO, our company does that. If you want to learn more about blockchain, there's 4 slides I've got on this. I'm going to go through very quickly. The first thing is I'd recommend you consider joining Hyperledger Group. For business applications, they have the best ones, and they do really good work, and they rely on partners since it's a nonprofit organization. You can get a lot of information by joining Hyperledger. Ethereum has actually a lot more programmers and developers, and they're very active. Every year they put on what's called DevCon, the Ethereum Foundation's Developers Conference. And I haven't seen yet where it's going to be in 2018, but they have multi-day sessions there. You can learn a lot. And they're very valuable to attend and learn more about blockchain and smart contracts. And again, things that Ethereum is doing, odds are you're going to be seeing the same kinds of programming and features in Hyperledger or other blockchain applications. A lot of courses you can take. Udemy has dozens of them, and I've used some of their courses. And they're pretty good, and they're very inexpensive online. So this is our last slide before we get into questions. It just kind of summarizes the areas of consulting that our firm does. And if you want to learn more about the assessment courses, I said Starweaver would be glad to work with you to set up training. And we also get into wargaming to test strategies and ICO advisory service as well. So with that, I'm going to take questions. And unfortunately, my companion computer that I was using to track the questions has gone down on me, turned itself off from inactivity. So Deepika, I can't see your questions right now. So you want to come on and tell me some? Or Paul, if you want to do that. Again, I'm open to questions, but unfortunately my side computer that was monitoring them shut down. So I can't see any questions people are asking right now. Well, if anyone doesn't have questions, I'll talk for a few minutes. I mentioned the book here, The Black Swan. It's the most valuable book that I've ever read on any business or topic for that matter. And it was so valuable that it was finished reading, and I actually wrote down and typed up some notes on the book. If you want to get those, you can contact me. If you want a copy of the slides, you can contact me. And I'd be glad to send you my Cliff Notes for that book, answer any other questions you've got by email, since I've lost my questions online.
Drew, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. So, yeah, the question first comes up is, are there tools that are more specifically suited to certain vertical industries or domains, or are the tools pretty much industry agnostic?
Our tool is very much industry agnostic, and it's less the industry you have to adapt to than a specific firm. So you want to be able to consider criteria that are relevant to your firm, conditions that are relevant to your firm. So you really need a flexible tool like this that'll let you consider any option and then any criteria you think is relevant.
And what are the biggest challenges of implementing the type of solutions that your tools will recommend? Is it more social engineering kinds of problems, as in, making sure the teams are on the same page, or is it more technical issues, or is it sort of industry life cycle issues? What do you think that the biggest challenges are making sure the blockchain applications are widely adopted?
Earlier on, I would say a year ago, the biggest problem was the blockchain technology just didn't have the capability yet. But that's kind of going away. The bigger problems you run into now is, can you get partners to use it? And that is a big problem, and unfortunately one that tends to be overlooked if you don't go through a process like this. A blockchain, I mean, if it's just information for your firm to use, you don't need a blockchain. You don't have to share it. But when you're sharing it, well, you have to have partners, and it's amazing to me that a lot of people will pursue a blockchain application but don't have partners to use it with them. IBM Maersk have a successful system now, but unless they can get the other shipping companies to start using it, it's probably not going to be that successful. They don't just want to be linked into Maersk, they want to be able to use other ocean shipping companies. So they're trying right now to open up their blockchain application to others, and so you really have to consider that difficulty and getting the partners on board that you'll need to make the system successful.
Okay. Are you, where are we on the curve of adoption of blockchain, do you think? Are we at an inflection point? Or are we still early in the day that we haven't reached the so-called tipping point where everyone will be moving in this direction?
Well, for big companies like the Fortune 500, most of them are already in blockchain. I'm not saying they've got a working application yet, but they're already developing it. So the Fortune 500 are, by and large, they're already in, and they'll be rolling out more of them. The supply chain applications, for example, that will impact every industry. And there's a lot of them existing now, more people jumping on. You know, it's impossible to predict these kinds of things, but I think you're just going to see it getting worse, not worse, but more and more active. I mean, was it Fortune or Business Week? I think it was Fortune had the front page in the fall, you know, blockchain mania. Businesses, especially bigger businesses, are aware of it, but they're going to impact all businesses. And if I was a medium business looking to grow in my industry, I would be interested in blockchain as a way for me to disrupt the industry and defeat the people who are bigger than me now, because I'm better at executing and leveraging blockchain to cut costs and improve business processes.
And will you see these, you think, more on a consumer-facing basis or more business-to-business and operational kind of supply chain orientation initially?
It's more business to business now, but for example, social media is starting to use blockchain for intellectual property. Remember, I had that slide on digital assets. So if I want to, you know, write some great article, I can post it and run it on a blockchain such that when people read my article, they keep track of it, and then, you know, I get some cryptocurrency token payment for it. So that's going to start reaching out more to consumers, but you're right. For now, it's largely business to business, but it'll eventually, you know, people say this is the second internet revolution. So just like the World Wide Web started off with, you know, pretty limited use, but then went everywhere, that's what we expect to have happen with blockchain. It'll be used in all industries and eventually consumers using it all the time too.
A question's come in. You mentioned that cryptocurrency is different than blockchain, but you bring it up often for pursuing private blockchain for developing, mitigating existing applications. Why is it inseparable?
Well, you can do a blockchain application and share data, and if it's a private blockchain, you don't have to have a cryptocurrency to use it. You could just say, hey, you got to pay a fee to join our system, or you got to agree to maintain a node, and you don't have a fee. So you can do a private blockchain with no cryptocurrency. But in general, it costs some money to, you know, process and run the transactions. And so you're going to see, I think, more examples of people actually using the cryptocurrency. If you want to use the Ethereum blockchain, you have to pay a small transaction fee in Ether, or gas, a subdivision of Ether. And if you want to use the Kick applications where they did a token issuing, a token offering, you've got to use their token. Fortitude Ranch, they issued a token. It's not a token to run transactions. They're not running a blockchain, but it's a token, a utility token, to let you buy their service. So you can do it without a cryptocurrency, but, you know, in terms of transactions, but in this case, they're using the cryptocurrency to pay for a service or a product.
Okay. We've pretty much reached the top of the hour, everyone. There's a very deep conversation. There's obviously a lot more that can be covered, and obviously the knowledge that Dr. Miller has is pretty profound. So I think that this is a great kickoff webinar. I appreciate everyone's time, Drew as well. Fantastic discussion.